We're going to talk a little bit about PERN, Pediatric Emergency Research Networks, and just wanted to have a conversation about some of the past, the present, and the future of PERN. So let's go back in time, if you will. Tell us about how it all started.
Yeah, sure. So it's actually kind of a fun story, Todd, and it's interesting because this year marks the 10-year anniversary of PERN, but it happened sort of serendipitously. There was a meeting of child health that was organized by Terry Klassen and one of his collaborators from the Netherlands, and it was in Amsterdam. It was in 2009, and Terry invited members of Pediatric Emergency Research Networks from around the world to attend, but really just to share best practices, get to know each other, interact. And it turns out we were in the middle of the H1N1 pandemic that we were all dealing with. So as we met each other in Amsterdam, we started thinking about, God, wouldn't it be interesting to collaborate on a global project? And it just so happened that H1N1 was around, and the big clinical conundrum that we were facing is that we were getting all these kids with influenza-like illness into our emergency departments, but we didn't know how to identify which ones were at risk for severe outcomes from H1N1. So in like 48 hours, as we gathered, we said, let's collaborate, and then let's build a network of networks around it. And that really was the start of PERN. As an aside, it was a really auspicious start because that study became a reality. We enrolled, I think, nearly 300 kids with H1N1 with severe outcomes, and we had 2 control groups. We identified some risk factors, and it was published in the British Medical Journal, which was a pretty good place to start for a fledgling network.
That's great. There aren't that many networks of this scale, and particularly ones where it's really sweat equity, right? And then besides the time zones and the language barriers and the distance, which are relatively inherent to any global networks, what were some of the things that you saw that were early successes, like your paper that you said about H1N1, as well as some of the barriers that was unanticipated?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think, the early successes of any network, and it's true in PERN, like it was true in PERN, is there was a tremendous esprit de corps. People willing to do sweat equity for this greater good. And there was something about the globalness of it, that despite all the political chaos in the world and the pressures of tribalism and people separating into their own silos, here we saw an opportunity for the world to get together for a greater good. And that was like this tremendous, and I'll never forget actually our first dinner was still there in Amsterdam. We had each brought a bottle of wine from our home countries, and we were, so it was a bottle per person basically we had at this dinner, and we were kind of like celebrating our newfound collaboration. So really what the early driver to success was this just sense of wanting to give to a greater good. The challenges that we found are similar somewhat to the PEM-CRC in that it was an unfunded network and remains an unfunded network, and there was cultural challenges. That is, it's one thing to have time zone differences and whatnot, but different countries have different approaches to clinical medicine and also have different access to technologies and whatnot. So we kind of realized early on, one of the things that we're going to have to overcome is that we can't do studies that are particularly bound to a specific type of technology, for example, that's available in one country and not available in another, and studies that have really distinct kind of cultural interpretations. Those become challenging when we're dealing with Middle East, South America, Europe, and North America. And I think as we move forward, but we've overcome these, so we've identified types of studies that work within that framework. But I do think what we're going to need to do to take us to the next level, similar to the networks which constitute PERN, is we do need some funding for some infrastructure. And in my mind, the kind of the core funding would be to have funding for a central data center, for example, that could help not only manage the data, but actually do some of the clinical coordination, because by definition in PERN, it involves people that are already involved with network research that is sucking their bandwidth and their time already, and this is just on top of that. So I do think that we really need some core funding, and that core funding would offset some of the administrative burden that we all have in running PERN. And then ultimately, in my mind, the sort of holy grail as we move forward, as you know, Todd, we've been successful doing retrospective chart review stuff. We've done a couple of registries, so Santi Minteghi's study on toxicology, I think, was a nice success. Each of the studies have actually been quite productive, but that was our first foray into almost prospective study, and now we're doing this pneumonia study. But really, in my mind, the big double-blinded clinical randomized trial conducted in each of the networks in PERN would be a great thing. But we won't get there until we have a little bit more infrastructure and more funding built around it.
So in pursuit of getting to that holy grail of infrastructure and those mega randomized controlled trials with the most rigor across 6-7 continents, so far we don't have anyone in Antarctica as far as I know. You actually, in service to that, and as well as your own professional growth, you had a recent sabbatical, met folks from REPEM and SPERG as part of the constituents of PERN. Can you tell us about some of the insights and the exciting stuff that you got to work with?
Sure. Yeah. So I actually had it was a great 3-month mini sabbatical. I spent 1 month in Padua, and Padua is important in REPEM. It's one of the few ground zero places for REPEM. REPEM being the European Peds Emergency Medicine Network, and I really worked with Sylvia Bresson and Liviana Dedalt. They are the kind of the core of Peds Emergency Medicine in Padua. As it turns out, in Italy, there's just a few sites that really do serious pediatric emergency medicine. Florence has some with Niccolo Pari is there, and then I think in Trieste they have some. But I was there in Padua to help, because Sylvia is now the co-director of REPEM with Rianne Osterbrink in the Netherlands. So I was there to help brainstorm with Sylvia to help her think about how to take REPEM to the next level, because I feel a responsibility now with global research that I did 15 years ago with PEDS-EM research domestically. That is, how do we take it to the next level, and how can I be of service in that? So in Italy, I was working closely with Sylvia, brainstorming around collaborative research in Italy and in Europe. The REPEM network is really fascinating because unlike PERC, the network in Canada, or PECAR in the United States, REPEM deals with transcultural barriers. Turkey is a part of REPEM, as is Italy, and so there's linguistic and cultural barriers that we don't have to deal with. So I helped her kind of think around that, think about projects, think about infrastructure building there. So that was a very lovely month, and of course we shared ideas and we gave seminars, and that was great. Then I spent the next 2 months in Bilbao. Well, actually I stayed in San Sebastian, which is part of the Basque Country. It's about an hour away from Bilbao, and I actually think Bilbao is ground zero for Peds Emergency Medicine research in Europe, because that's where Santi Minteghi is and Javier Benito. And the reason I was there was because, first of all, they're good friends of mine. That's another, that is a real fundamental building block on the start of networks, having these social bonds, because as I mentioned, there's a lot of sweat equity, and you can feel good about sweat equity when you're doing sweat equity with good friends. So, but beyond that, Santi Minteghi and I share a common research interest, and that's around the febrile infant. And I would say right now there's 2 current generation febrile infant prediction rules out there. Santi and what is Gomez's first name? Oh, I'm just blanking on his first name. Borja Gomez and Santi, they have the step-by-step prediction rule on febrile infants. And as you know, I've been working on the PECAR febrile infant prediction rule, which was recently published. So there, our goal was to figure out, not PERN or versus step by step, but together, how do we get people to implement evidence around the febrile infant into the management? Because the variation around the febrile infant, as you know, is tremendous. And when you see big variation, almost by definition, there's a quality issue there. The range of practice shouldn't be from here to here. It really should be from here to here. And we wanted to figure out a way to bring evidence to the bedside around the febrile infant. So we spent a couple of months working on that. And it wasn't really to promote PERN, and it wasn't to promote the step-by-step. We really took a global approach to that. And that is whatever evidence, we just want people to use evidence in their decision making, because you would be surprised. There are countries that don't even get urine on the young febrile infant, and then there's other places which do way too much. So really that 2 months was spent on thinking about implementation science. And that is something that's, as a side note, that networks need to think about, because now networks have been in existence for, in Canada, more than 2 decades. I think PERN, which is the Canadian network, is the oldest network. They started in the mid-90s. PERN started in 2001. But now we have a repository of evidence. Our next challenge is how do we get people to implement this very ripe evidence that we have? And that's what I was doing with the folks in Spain around the febrile infant. How do we get people to implement evidence at the bedside?
Some of the things that we're hearing about the future include getting better implementation science, getting that holy grail, the type of research that we want in the prospective randomized controlled trial across multiple continents. These seem very ambitious, even though there have been clearly a track record of success. Let's say in the next 3 years, so it's 2019, Stuart Dalziel is currently the chair of PERN. What can we do globally in 3 years? What do you see as a short-term goal, and then your long-term goals for PERN?
So I think, so the short-term goal is, following kind of the steps from retrospective chart review to, one of the holy grails, the prospective randomized trial. So we're doing that now. So we have this pneumonia study, which is, at least it's prospective, it's observational data, as you know, but it is prospectively gathered, inputted electronically, and will hopefully come up with an answer to an important question. So this is our first true prospective trial in PERN. To get us to the next step, which is the multi-center randomized trial in PERN, I think involves a few different things. As I mentioned before, it does involve funding, and there's going to need to be funding for central coordination, and there's going to need to be funding for sites. So that's going to be challenging. That might involve, in fact, we in anticipation of this, there's a few trials that we are discussing in PERN and PERN that might involve getting an NIH grant for implementation in the United States, getting another one in Europe for implementation in REPEM, and getting one in Australia for implementation in PREDICT. But we do need to think about training, not just investigator, but training networks. So Todd, as you know, PERN has slowly grown over time. We started in 2009 as a network of 5 networks. And now I think we're a network of 7 networks. Since the initial part, Peruki, which is the UK network, has joined. SPERG joined, the Spanish network. But each network is at a different phase of its development. So I think one of our things, until we get to the big holy grail studies, is that we have to mentor networks so that we're all at a certain level to be able to conduct these trials with really high fidelity so that the results can be sort of indisputable. So that's what I think our next challenges are in PERN. Getting funding, mentoring both individuals and the networks that are in PERN so that we can really conduct these trials in the best possible fashion.